All right, thanks, Gene. Yeah, so my name is Dan Bigelow. I'm an assistant professor and extension economist at Oregon State in the applied economics department. And so I'm not going to talk about anything specifically related to the ESA today, but I'm going to delve a little bit more deeply into the concept of conservation easements, which are kind of a large part of a lot of ESA related efforts. And so I'll start by just sort of providing a big picture overview, then focus in on conservation easements on working land, um, and then kind of wrap up with a discussion of a research paper that looks at the relationship between conservation easement adoption and farm investment behavior. Okay, and so just to make sure everyone's got the same baseline here, when we talk about conservation easements, we're referring to a voluntary, private form of land conservation. Okay, so typically easements involve the permanent transfer of development rights from a private landowner to a land trust in exchange for tax benefits or cash. And it varies on a case-by-case basis, but individual easements will often specify additional provisions for land use practices or production practices potentially. But the common theme across all conservation easements is that you have this landowner who's giving up their rights to develop the land in the future. And so one way that people commonly think of easements is through this bundle of sticks analogy, where if you think about a private landowner, there's a bundle of property rights that comes along with their ownership of the land. And under an easement, they retain ownership of the land, okay, but they give up one of their property rights, namely the right to develop their land in the future, okay? Easements are also generally permanent, right? Meaning that they transfer with the land regardless of who ends up owning it in the future. Okay, and so the value of conservation easements comes from the fact that when farmland is subject to development pressure, its value is bid up due to the capitalization of expected future non-agricultural, in this case, development-related returns. So just as a simple hypothetical example, if we took a piece of farmland located right next to the outskirts of Bend, say, and then we took another parcel of farmland, same production potential, same water rights, same soil quality, and moved that 3 miles further away from Bend, the parcel right on the outskirts of Bend is going to be worth considerably more, not because of anything related to agriculture, but just because development would be seen as being more imminent, more likely to occur in the near future. Okay, and so it's really these capitalized future development returns that form the basis for the value of the conservation easement, at least as things currently stand right now. Okay, and so if you're a landowner, why on earth would you want to give up potentially one of the property rights you have in your land? There are a few different types of incentives that could be at work here. A big one is that under the federal income tax code, conservation easements are treated as a charitable donation, okay? And as such, that value, the value of the easement, can be deducted from your federal income tax bill. And so for qualifying farm producers, an important provision here is that you can carry the value of this easement deduction over for a period of up to 15 years. And that's a really important provision because easements can easily get into millions of dollars in terms of their value, and you can't deduct more than you make in any given year from your federal income taxes. So that's an important provision that applies specifically to farmers. Individual states often have additional tax-related incentives. These usually come in the form of deductions or income tax credits. So in Oregon, we have a state deduction on easements. California, other states, Colorado, they have a credit, which tends to be more lucrative from the perspective of the land owner. There are also estate tax benefits. These usually, again, come in the form of benefits for state-administered estate taxes. And it's less common, but there are also cases where the land trust will purchase the easement outright. And so it's less common because land trusts tend to be pretty small, pretty local outfits. They don't have the budget to be spending millions of dollars to protect individual pieces of land. But there is some federal involvement here as well that kind of helps to pave the way for this to be a little bit more practical. So the USDA's NRCS, through the Agricultural Land Easement Program, will essentially match up to 50% of the cash value for an easement. And they'll work in concert with a local land trust where the land trust will ultimately hold the easement, but there will be some cost sharing involved in the acquisition process. And then there are other cases where you could see a combination of cash transfer and tax incentives through what are known as bargain sales. Those are pretty common in Colorado. Other states have them as well, but it's just kind of a hybrid of these two models. Okay, so I'm going to throw an equation here. It's an economics presentation. You weren't going to get away without seeing one equation. I'll have another one later in the talk, but this is the more important one for just kind of making things a little bit more concrete. So we can think about the value of agricultural land subject to development pressure, okay, V, as being made up of agriculture-related returns, okay, where A is going to be the net income from farming in a given year, R is the discount rate. When we divide that by that, we get an infinite stream of net income related to farming. And so this term right here is essentially going to give us the value of the land if it has no development potential, or if the landowner has given up the right to develop that land in the future. Okay, and at some future time period, we'll call it T star, the annual net income from owning the land is going to increase by some amount D. Okay, and so this is really just conceptually where the value of conservation easements comes from, right? This is what professional appraisers are actually estimating when they put a dollar value on conserving a particular piece of land. And so since easements are based on sort of hypothetical land values with and without specific property rights attached to the land, the values are generally estimated through comparable sales and other professional appraisal approaches. Okay, and I apologize if you can't see the text here in this table, but this shows basically a bunch of different conservation measures in terms of acreage held between 1990 and 2010, based on a paper by Nick Parker and Wally Thurman. So it's not critical that you can see all of these numbers, but the top panel here shows the amount of land held by the BLM, Forest Service, National Park Service, FWS, kind of major federal land-oriented agencies. And that's grown pretty modestly in most cases over this 20-year period. Then we have other federal programs, state parks, and then down here at the bottom, we have land trust activity. Okay, so land trusts do own land outright. It's not as common as easements, but outright ownership by land trusts more than tripled over this 20-year period. from just over 2 million acres to about 7.5 million acres. But conservation easements are really where land trust activity took off in recent years. Okay, so in 1990, we were talking about less than 800,000 acres of private land in conservation easements. And then by 2010, we're up over 13 million acres, right? So this is a staggering amount of growth, and really just goes to show that conservation easements are really the primary modern private land conservation tool, okay? And so these numbers here all apply to easements in general. What I'm now going to do is show a few slides that look at conservation easements on working farmland in particular. Okay, so this is showing the number of easements established per year from 1980 to 2023. This comes from the National Conservation Easement Database. It's incomplete, but it's the best, most comprehensive data that we have available. And you can see that it's really in the 2000s, late 90s, 2000s, and then early 2010s, where easements on working farmland really took off. And then it's come down a little bit since then. I wouldn't put too much stock into the last few years here. This database is constantly being updated, and that's where the data are going to be the most incomplete. Okay, and now this is showing currently, as things currently stand, the number of easements across states. So darker red colors here mean more easements. And you can see that easements are really common, really popular in the Northeast, where there's a lot of population pressure and a dwindling amount of farmland. Midwest has quite a few as well, and then Colorado has a ton. California has quite a bit, and Oregon really kind of lags behind the US as a whole in terms of conservation easement activity on working farmland. Okay, this is showing just the same thing now, but in terms of acreage. So when we look at acreage conserved through easements, a lot of those Northeast states kind of are de-emphasized, I guess. Farms just tend to be smaller there. And places like Montana and Wyoming, they really start to pop out just because farms are a lot bigger in those states. And Oregon, although it kind of creeps up the rankings a little bit, is still pretty low in terms of the overall scheme of farmland related conservation easements in the US. And so I'll come back in a minute and talk about Oregon a little bit more and what some groups are trying to do to promote more easement uptake in our state. I just want to hit on a couple of other contemporary issues that are often brought up when talking about conservation easements. So a couple of them have to do with the permanence provision, right? So in order to qualify for those tax benefits I mentioned before, the easements need to be permanent. They need to carry with the land in perpetuity. And so although this can allow for an easier time dealing with things like estate taxes, it is a really complicated process when it comes to estate transfer that turns a lot of landowners off because they're essentially making decisions on behalf of all future generations of their family or whoever ends up owning the land. There's also the argument that by constraining the supply of developable land around a city, you could have this kind of perverse outcome where down the road, you may end up promoting indirectly more kind of fragmented, patchy patterns of development that kind of run counter to the conservation aims of the easement in the first place. Syndicated easements, this is something that you see articles about every now and then. It's a little bit more, I don't know, clickbaity, I guess, but basically a syndicated easement is when investors from outside the ag sector pool their money together, buy some land, and then get what, I don't know, a lot of people would consider to be kind of a bogus appraisal put on it in terms of its development potential, and then they can take advantage of the tax provisions. And then there's also issues concerning public finance and property tax revenues in particular. So one point I really want to make here is that putting an easement on a parcel of farmland does not degrade the current tax base of the county, right? And that's because in all 50 states, nearly all farmland receives current use assessment or use value assessment or special use assessment, as it's referred to here in Oregon, right? So those development rights were already not being accounted for in current property tax assessment. There is, though, an argument that down the road, by not allowing that land to be developed, you could be degrading the future tax base of a county, say. But at the same time, if having nearby open space boosts nearby home values, then there could be, a compensation for that foregone revenue by collecting higher property taxes from those properties. So just let it suffice to say that the public finance issues surrounding easements are more nuanced than I think are sometimes appreciated. Okay, so coming back to Oregon now. So why do we have such low easement activity in our state? So this is in large part due, at least many people think it's due, to our state's urban growth boundary policy, substantially reducing the market value of farmland outside of UGBs. And this is kind of an active area of research I'm working on as well. But essentially, outside of UGBs, development rights are heavily restricted. There are still some forms of rural development that you can do, agritourism, for instance, but even those are pretty restricted, and you can't, for instance, subdivide your land as you would be able to inside of the boundary. And so a big area of innovation in conservation easement design sort of revolves around distinguishing between the development value of land, right? What the landowner is giving up in the easement, and the conservation value land, right? What the public at large is getting by conserving that land. And so I recently served as a reviewer on a pilot project conducted by East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. They are trying to put easements within their service area, which is entirely outside of the UGB, the Portland UGB. And they're trying to put easements on land, but the values are just not big enough in terms of development value. So they have this pilot project where they're starting to incorporate ecosystem service values into the easement appraisal process. And in their case, at least, it results in substantially higher payments to landowners, but reasonably higher values too. It's not anything ridiculous from what I've seen so far, at least. So this is, I know there are folks in Colorado at Colorado State University who I know are working on kind of trying to get a model like this started. But there are, of course, several sources of difficulty here, particularly around the, how do we put a dollar value on nature, right? How do we put a dollar value on ecosystem services? We're learning more and more about that. There's, that's an area, a huge area of research and development. But I think a bigger concern too, in terms of actually getting more uptake of this type of easement valuation process, is the fact that you aren't going to qualify for any of those tax benefits if the easement value is not based on development value, right? So essentially what this requires is that land trusts if they wanted to do this, would have to purchase the easement for cash, which again goes back to some of the budget constraint issues I mentioned earlier. Okay, and so I want to change gears here now a little bit and talk about a research paper that I have that builds on, it's with a former master's student of mine at Montana State, Connor McCullum. I was at Montana State before coming to OSU last year. And the idea of this research kind of revolves around the fact that agricultural landowners rely heavily on their land as a source of collateral in securing farm-related loans. Okay, and so there are two basic questions that we ask in this paper. The first is, to what extent are landowners able to lean on capitalized future development potential that's sort of embedded in the value of their land, right? When they go out and try to secure a loan to invest in their operation. In other words, how are development values accounted for, if they are accounted for, in farm lending appraisals? Okay, and second, if they aren't accounted for, what role might easements play in easing? Didn't mean to do that. What role do conservation easements play in easing this potential credit constraint? Okay, and so when I say that lenders may not be fully taking into account the development value of farmland when they're doing collateral appraisals, I'm not making a statement that they're like ignorant of how land markets work or something like that, but there are good, financially sound, rational reasons why they probably would not be doing this. So the first is that it would increase default risk. Okay, so if you're making a loan for ag-related investment, it's going to be serviced with ag-related income, maybe some income from off the farm as well. But in general, you want the collateral value to reflect the purpose of the loan. Otherwise, it creates a wedge that may increase default risk. Housing markets are volatile. There's a lot of uncertainty over things like population growth and future development patterns. And so that might lead lenders to be a little bit more conservative in this regard as well. And the last is preferences for speedy liquidation. So if there's a default, the land's generally going to go to auction. They're going to want to sell the land and recoup that asset value quickly, and they may not be able to get the full market value in a liquidation proceeding. And this is also why we see things like collateral to loan value ratios well in excess of 100% in a lot of cases. But the main point I want to get across here is that if producers cannot access this development-oriented land capital, if that development-oriented land capital is illiquid from their perspective, when it comes to these traditional lending channels, easements may be the only option that allows them to do so, to access that capital, and at the same time remain in agriculture. Okay, and this link was first laid out in an earlier research study. And so there are two parts of the paper here that I'll just kind of quickly walk you through now. The first thing that we do is we construct a county level farm real estate debt to asset ratio using census data from 2002 to 2022. So I just updated this a couple weeks ago with the new census data. And so what we're doing is we're taking the total value of farm real estate reported in the census and dividing into that the total debt secured by farm real estate. Okay, so this is the fraction of farm real estate basically that's made up by debt secured by farm real estate. And then what we do is we look within states and look at the relationship between this farm real estate debt to asset ratio measure and different measures of development pressure, right? So if producers are not able to sort of tap into this source of land capital, development related land capital, we would expect these correlations to be negative. And we look at population density at the county level and sort of a historic measure of how much farmland had been developed in an earlier period. And on the whole, what we find is that there's a very strong, consistent negative correlation between development pressure and this farm real estate debt to asset ratio. Okay, across all years, all different development related variables we considered. And so this is at least consistent with the story that there is this type of credit constraint that's operating in agricultural finance markets, basically. Okay, and then the primary part of the paper is where we look at the relationship directly between past easement activity and different investment related outcomes from the Census of Ag. Again, same years here, we're pooling them all together in this model. It's not critical that you can follow this, but this is a distributed lag model for those of you who are interested. So we're basically looking at earlier easement activity and as that relates to some investment related outcome. So the investment outcomes that we consider are related to land ownership. So the percent of land that's owned by the operator in part owner operations, the percent of their expenses that are spent on rent, investment in debt relief, so the percent of expenses on interest payments in general and interest payments on debt secured by real estate. This could be kind of, this relationship could go either way, where producers may be using easements to pay down existing debt, or they may be using it to be, it may put them in a better, more secure financial position to take on existing debt, to take on additional debt. Machinery, right now, we're only looking at the number of tractors in use, just because that's something that's widely available across the US, but we're working on updating this to come up with a more comprehensive measure of machinery related investment. Okay, and then labor investment, the number of hired workers, both full and part-time. And I should say that these are all things that have kind of been looked at when it comes to easements in smaller scale local survey work. And so what we're basically doing is scaling that up to the US as a whole and looking at whether or not these relationships are borne out in observational data. Okay, and so for some preliminary results, on the land ownership side, we find a really strong positive relationship between easements and land ownership. Okay, and that's sort of bolstered by this strong negative relationship between easements and cash rent expenses. And again, I'm not talking about per acre cash rents here. I'm talking about just the total amount, the total percentage that the producers are spending on cash rent. So this is consistent with the land ownership story here. In terms of interest expenses, we find a positive relationship, but it's pretty noisy, has a large margin of error on it, so can't really hang your hat on that. We find a really strong, again, consistent, positive relationship with machinery usage and easements. And then labor, again, it's positive, but pretty noisy. So on the whole, what the results suggest is that easements do play a role in allowing for greater levels of farm investment than otherwise would have taken place. So just wrapping up with some limitations. So, I mean, we're doing this all at the county level. We'd prefer to do it at sort of a smaller scale just because easements account for such a small percentage of farmland in most counties. But I think that's something we'll just have to look at for now, live with for now, and then maybe look at in an extension of this work. I mentioned the machinery use thing. And then the one thing we want to do on this iteration of the paper before we get it submitted somewhere is to look more explicitly at the role played by these state policies and looking at whether states with more generous incentives see a stronger relationship between easements and investment. Okay, and so I'm going to wrap up there. My contact information's on the slide. Love to hear from you. Big thanks to Jean for letting me be part of this event today. I've learned a ton. And I have a partial extension appointment. So if you wouldn't mind doing the little phone scan thing, QR code, leaving me your feedback. It's totally anonymous. So any honest feedback would be welcome. Yeah, thanks again for listening, and looking forward to the panel discussion and Q&A.